see the screen.
Oh, you can see me. Okay, so if you see me, that's fine. Okay, I can only see my own screen, so I was wondering. Okay, right. Then let me start.
1 quick second. Let me start the recording again.
Thank you.
Okay, we're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for your invitation. So let me start. Reading Kazuo Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun as a modern interpretation of Mansfield Park. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the Nobel Prize in Literature 2017 was awarded to a Japanese-born British author, Kazuo Ishiguro. In his novels, Ishiguro deals with difficult themes such as the meanings of life for people who are socially deprived. For instance, in Ishiguro's masterpiece, The Remains of the Day, the butler, Mr. Stevens, recalls his life at Darlington Hall, where he faithfully serves his master for decades. In Never Let Me Go, the carer, Kathy H., relates her life growing up in a secluded school where children are destined to become organ donors. The loyal service of Kathy and Mr. Stevens goes unnoticed by their wealthy superiors, but elicit the reader's sorrow and empathy. Jane Austen's reserved heroines, Fanny Price in Mansfield Park and Anne Elliot in Persuasion, are placed in similar positions to Ishiguro's protagonists, although Fanny is a niece and Anne is a daughter of a baronet. They have limited opportunities to enjoy social life. Instead, they serve their family and friends, listening to their complaints and offering useful advice, yet their service is scarcely appreciated. The similarity between the roles and subordinate positions of Austen and Ishiguro's characters has rarely drawn scholarly attention. A rare exception is Sarah Daniels, who humorously remarked when she announced Ishiguro's Nobel Prize, quote, "I would say, if you mix Jane Austen and Franz Kafka, you get Ishiguro in a nutshell. But you have to add a little bit of Marcel Proust into the mix. Stir, but not too much, and then you have his writing," unquote. Research comparing novels of Austen and Ishiguro has not, however, advanced since then. The Remains of the Day drew some comparisons with Austen's novels when it was first published in 1989. This was largely due to its setting in an English countryside. Ishiguro's departure from historical drama in his later novels, some of which have been categorized as fantasy or dystopian fiction, seems to have made readers and critics assume that his fictional works bear no resemblance to Austen's. Interestingly, Ishiguro has occasionally mentioned in his interviews the influence of Austen's writings. At an event commemorating bicentenary of Austen's death in 2017, he explicitly referred to Mansfield Park, observing that, quote, "I've learned so much from this profound novelist about nuance, understatement, technique," unquote. Ishiguro's acknowledgement of Austen's skillful writing techniques is important. It makes me realize that the connection between their novels is not limited to setting or to the life of British nobility, but is something more fundamental. The connection lies in the way that both authors present a world in which people live with constraints. As they focus on protagonists whose liberty of speech is restricted due to decorum and social hierarchies, their narratives often convey complex observations and emotions that are not explicitly stated. Therefore, deciphering the narrative structures of novels by Austen and Ishiguro will be key to understanding their similarities. I will compare Austen's most subordinate heroine, Fanny Price, with the heroine of Ishiguro's latest novel, Klara and the Sun, a story of a humanoid robot. Klara's ambiguous status in society and the household is similar to Fanny's position in Mansfield Park. I will identify elements that make Klara a modern-day Fanny Price and examine both writers' elaborate narrative techniques that allow the reader to emphasize with these socially downtrodden heroines. Part 1. Klara and the Sun is narrated in the first person from the viewpoint of Klara. In the opening scene of the novel, Klara describes the shop where she is looking out the window on the busy street and observing the people passing by. Klara and other robots are called AFs, aka artificial friend, as they are designed to be companions of teenagers. These solar-powered robots have a high level of intelligence, great vision and hearing, a delicate sense of touch, and fine cognitive abilities. They are smaller in size than preteens, with each AF possessing a unique appearance and quality. While Klara is in the shop, waiting for a customer to choose her, the manager teaches the robots manners. For example, the manager tells them that it's highly vulgar to make eye contact with a passerby who comes up to look at an AF in the window. She also teaches them about human emotions, such as how elderly people may feel pain and happiness when they meet old friends after a long separation, or how children can be self-centered by making promises that they never fulfill. The shop, therefore, functions as a kind of boarding school. Klara quickly learns about human society thanks to her ability to pay attention to details. This increases her emotional intelligence to the highest AF level. When Josie visits the shop with her mother, the manager explains, quote, her ability to absorb and blend everything she sees around her is quite amazing. As a result, she now has the most sophisticated understanding of any AF in this store, unquote. Unlike Austen's third-person omniscient narrator, most of Ishiguro's novels are written in the first person. Critics have sometimes viewed these first-person narratives as unreliable. However, the manager's repeated compliments on Klara's sharp observation endorse her ability to present an objective point of view. I will explore this further in part 2 of my presentation. I'm now going to compare the status and roles of Klara and Fanny Price, both the expectations and the reality of their situations after they are brought to their new homes. In the opening chapter of Mansfield Park, the narrator details why Fanny was taken from her natal home in Portsmouth to live with her uncle, Sir Thomas Bertram, and his family at Mansfield Park. 10-year-old Fanny is Lady Bertram's niece. She is chosen from among her many siblings to receive an education as a gentlewoman, which will give her more opportunities in life and improve her marriage prospects. Her aunt, Mrs. Norris, argues for such a so benevolent a scheme, explaining in this way, quote, "A niece of ours, Sir Thomas, would not grow up in this neighborhood without many advantages. She would be introduced into the society of this country under such very favorable circumstances as, in all human probability, would get her a credible establishment," unquote. Jane Austen's contemporary readers would have associated this passage with popular courtship novels such as Fanny Burney's Evelina, subtitled "The History of a Young Lady's Entrance into the World." They may also have been reminded of Maria Edgeworth's Belinda, in which Mrs. Stanhope contrives a marriage for her unmarried niece. From Austen's own novels, we will think of Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, who has 5 daughters and is desperate to see them married men of fortune. Through her marriage to Sir Thomas, Lady Bertram achieves this goal and rises to the rank of a baronet's wife. Fanny, however, experiences very different circumstances from those initially envisaged by Mrs. Norris. By the age of 18, Fanny has indeed been educated as a gentlewoman, but her modesty and sense of obligation make her diffident, and her aunts and cousins treat her unfairly, often using her for errands. Fanny's role in the house is as companion to Lady Bertram, whose indolence has made her give up society and live peacefully at home. Meanwhile, Mrs. Norris has assumed Lady Bertram's role and acts as a chaperone to Julia and Maria Bertram, but excludes Fanny from enjoying equal privileges, while her cousins pursue their own pleasure in social activities. Fanny is left at home to take care of Lady Bertram and spend time sewing. Although Klara is more confident and active than Fanny, her status and role in the house are remarkably similar to Fanny's. Josie and her mother live in a large house on the outskirts of a city, isolated from all other houses but one, a situation similar to that of Mansfield Park. Josie is thin and pale with a medical condition, yet she is cheerful and outspoken. When Josie meets Klara in the shop, she promises Klara that, "I think you like our house. I think you like my room, and that's where you'll be, not in some cupboard or anything. And you do all these great things together all the time I'm growing up." However, as soon as Klara arrives at the house, she realizes that her duty as an artificial friend brings her into conflict with the housekeeper. For example, every morning, Melania housekeeper serves Josie and the mother, who spend coffee time in the kitchen. Melania prevents Klara from joining them and insists that she stands by the bridge. When Josie visits her next door neighbor, Rick, Melanie comes between Josie and Klara and takes Josie's arm. Klara has no choice but to follow them. Despite Clara's efforts to be friendly and speak politely to Melania, the housekeeper is cold and shouts at Klara. Melania's animosity towards Klara parallels Mrs. Norris's unkind behavior to Fanny. Like Melania, Mrs. Norris treats Fanny as a social inferior. Other parallels between Klara and Fanny can be found throughout the first half of Klara and the Sun. Klara has never been outside before she leaves the shop, just as Fanny has rarely left Mansfield Park from the age of 10 to 18. Josie's behavior when Klara first arrives mirrors that of Edmund Bertram, both act as a friend and protector. Josie tries to please Klara by showing her the sunset and by arranging for her to accompany the family on an outing. Edmund arranges a horse for Fanny when her pony dies and tries to include Fanny on a visit to Southerton Court. Just as Fanny's enjoyment relies on Edmund's thoughtfulness, so too does Klara rely on Josie's invitations. Neither have a natural right to pleasure. When there is a home party called the interaction meeting, Josie's attitude towards Klara changes as she forgets about Klara when her guests arrive. Clara's humility prevents her from thinking she has no equal right to Josie's attention, and so she stays outside the sliding door. The reader may recall a similar scene in Mansfield Park when Sir Thomas returns home from her Antigua. Fanny decides not to disturb the family reunion. Like Klara, Fanny is much too humble to give her any idea of classing herself with children, as Austen says. Now I'm going to proceed to part 2, which is about narrative techniques and social justice. Austen and Ishiguro employ to make the reader empathize with Fanny and Klara, as well as to see the fictional world from an objective point of view by the use of narrative techniques. Firstly, I will introduce Jane Austen's use of free indirect discourse in third-person narratives. This is a technique that allows a character's speech or thought presentation to be seamlessly interwoven in the narration, while retaining the narrator's objective and occasionally ironic viewpoint. Let me show you a simple example. So here I have written direct speech, free indirect speech, and indirect speech examples. In a sentence of a free indirect discourse, the speech tag she said or he thought is omitted. But the subject and the verb in the reported passage are referential to the narration in the third person past tense. Free indirect discourse gradually emerged in the 18th century alongside the standardization of how to quote speech in the text. The device is indispensable in modern fiction, and critics have acclaimed Austen as the first author in English to fully exploit this style. It is a kind of chimera of first-person and third-person narration that can create various effects, such as enabling smooth shifts from the speech or thought part to the narration, producing irony, or presenting collected voice. Austen's use of this technique has been discussed by JASNA members for decades, notably Louise Fleven, Clara Tewitt, and Kenneth Mora. Since the start of studies into this narrative device, there has been an assumption among literary critics that this is used predominantly for the representation of consciousness. Indeed, in Emma, it is often used to prevent the heroine's internal speech. However, Austen's skillful use of the device to represent spoken words has been misunderstood by literary critics and historians that it is solely used for satirizing speech. According to literary linguists, Jeffrey Leach and Michael Short, who established the foundations of stylistics in the 1980s, the device creates a different effect depending on whether it is used for speech or thought. When used to represent thought, the reader is drawn closer to the inner voice of a character, as if a camera were to zoom into an object and reveal the inner workings of someone's mind. However, when this style is used for speech representation, it creates the opposite effect, as the reader is distanced from the speaker's voice. So in this diagram, the statisticians divided speech and thought presentations, and you can see the arrows are different, pointing out on the opposite directions. And when this discourse is used for speech, which they call screen-like speech, that is towards the narrator's voice, while if it is used for thought consciousness, which is called screen-like thought, the direction is to the character's voice. So using these two modes, the Austen is trying to control the distance of the readers from the speakers or the narrators. Based on this stylistic theory, I argue that Austen uses screen-like speech in a more complex way to make the reader feel present at the scene from an objective viewpoint, as well as to represent the consciousness of a character. Here is a scene from Volume 1, Chapter 2 of Mansfield Park, where Edmund speaks with his little cousin, Fanny, soon after she is brought to Mansfield Park. This is the first time that their conversation is reported in the novel, and Austen uses screen-like discourse to contrast the two speakers' attitudes. Fanny is missing her family, especially her dear brother, William, while Edmund tries to console her. So it's quite a long passage, so I'm not going to read everything, but you can see the first time when Fanny speaks, it says, William did not, she should come away. He had told her he should, sorry, I can't see this because of the, she should come away. He had told her she should miss her very much indeed. So usually we use you or I when we are speaking, but she doesn't speak about herself as I, but she calls herself as she. And of course, this is not the actual representation. This is the Austen's manipulation. This is an excerpt from a long conversation between Edmund and Fanny, where the mode of speech gradually changes to reflect their attitude and relationship as the conversation progresses. The normal way to present a dialogue is to use direct speech. Edmund's speech is natural with the use of I and you. However, Fanny's speech is rephrased in the third person past tense in the same style as the third person narration. With the use of screen-like speech, the reader is distanced from Fanny's voice. Without the narrator's additional descriptions, the reader immediately understands that Edmund is actively committed in the conversation to removing Fanny's awkward feelings, while Fanny is passive due to her humility. Thanks to the different modes chosen for the two speakers, the reader can recognize Fanny's feelings of inferiority on arriving in the Bertram family. Then, what about Ishiguro? Most of his novels are written in the first person. This means that a character in the fictional world narrates a story that the reader shares the protagonist's subjective viewpoint. However, Ishiguro's narrators are often placed in the position of observer. They observe scenes in which other characters speak and act. This narrative structure is somewhat similar to Austen's. For example, in Sense and Sensibility, Elena Dashwood continuously watches her sister Marianne's remarks and attitudes towards Willoughby. Clara's subordinate position as a robot often makes her a bystander in a scene. This recalls a writing style called the novel of circulation or the it narrative. It is a literary genre that was popular from the late 18th century to early 19th century. Objects and animals, such as coins, clocks, carriages, clothes, or pets, play the role of the narrator to disclose people's private lives. In a 2008 interview, Ishiguro acknowledges his debt to 19th century traditional English fiction. Quote, "It's realist in this sense, in the sense that the world created in the fiction is more or less akin to the world we live in." Unquote. In this respect, I found Ishiguro's first-person narrative slightly different from other first-person narratives. For example, Jane Eyre, another first-person novel in which an orphan Jane is also placed in an inferior social status as governess. However, whereas Jane Eyre is an autobiographical and details Jane's own life events, Klara narrates in the third person to make observation about other characters. This narrative technique is much closer to Sense and Sensibility and Eleanor's position as an observer of Marianne. Thus, Ishiguro's narrative mode shifts towards Austenian third-person narration. Ishiguro uses third-person subjects not only in the narrative, but also in Clara's speech. Here is a scene where Josie introduces Klara to her best friend, Rick. So here you can see Josie and Rick are speaking in the direct speech as natural. But Clara's speech, let me quote, "It's very nice to meet Rick," I said. "I wonder if he lives in that neighbor house. It's strange, but I haven't noticed such a house before." So this is not quite free-like discourse as the present tense is used. However, Clara's formality to address others using the third person is distinctive. Instead of saying, "It's nice to meet you," or "I wonder if you live," she talks to Rick using the third person. Similar to the dialogue between Fanny and Edmund, only Clara's speech is indirect, which makes the reader aware of her keeping a distance like a humble servant. In contrast, the mode of speech used by Josie and Rick is straightforward, direct speech. Klara also addresses others in the third person, such as the mother, Melanie housekeeper, or Mr. Paul. This can simply be interpreted by the fact that Klara is a robot and remembers people's names by assigning labels. However, she later addresses Rick using the second person you when they have established mutual trust as friends to support Josie. Therefore, Ishiguro has specifically chosen the style to create a particular effect in the story. So now, as we are meeting today to celebrate Jane Austen in the Pan Pacific, I'd like to suggest some elements that may have come from Ishiguro's heritage in Japan. Ishiguro came to came to the UK at the age of 5 and received all his education in England. He does not speak in Japanese at press conferences or interviews. However, he often mentions that his family originally intended to go back to Japan and that his grandparents sent him parcels full of Japanese educational books so he could keep up with Japanese culture. Ishiguro thus formed his image of Japan via the experiences of older generation. Klara's use of the third person to address someone is a recurring theme in Ishiguro's second book, The Artist of the Floating World, set in Japan a few years after the World War II. I have a translation of this book translated by Shigeo Tobita. This is a very good translator. Ishiguro is a very popular writer in Japan. So in this novel, the daughters do not address their father by name or as you. Instead, they refer to him only as father. The protagonist is a retired painter and his former apprentices call him master or sensei. This is the Japanese title used to address teachers, doctors, and lawyers. To address someone by this title and without using you is to show respect to the addressee. However, it also emphasizes the hierarchical society. This reminds us of Austen's use of titles. Living in a patriarchal society, Mrs. Bennet calls her husband Mr. Bennet. After Emma and Mr. Knightley are engaged, Mr. Knightley asks Emma, quote, "And cannot you call me George now?" "Impossible. I never can call you anything but Mr. Knightley." However, between Mr. Knightley and his brother, John Knightley, no such formality exists. They call each other by their first names, George and John, which shows their equal standing at a personal level, irrespective of their difference in income or social status. Perhaps it is this formality and the depiction of a polite society that makes it easy for the modern Japanese reader to understand Austen's fictional world. When Fanny hesitates to accept a role in the private theatrical in Mansfield Park, Mrs. Norris calls her, quote, "very ungrateful considering who and what she is." Even though it is unkind of Mrs. Norris to accuse Fanny in this way, she points out the reality of Fanny's status. In this context, it is also reasonable that Sir Thomas expostulates Fanny when she turns down Henry Crawford's proposal of marriage. Oops. Sorry, I did. Yes, it is at the bottom of the slide. Quote, "You have now shown me that you can be willful and perverse, that you can and will decide for yourself the advantage or disadvantage of your family, of your parents, your brothers and sisters, never seems to have had a moment's share in your thoughts on this occasion." Of course, the reader knows Fanny's real reason for her rejection of Henry Crawford. Fanny's ill opinion of Henry is disclosed only in the narration with free indirect discourse. As a faithful niece, she has no power of speech to explain the real reason for her refusal to Sir Thomas. Ishiguro represents a similar scene in Klara and the Sun during the interaction meeting, when Klara is surrounded by Josie's friends and pressured to speak about what she has seen in order to test her cognitive abilities. I'm not going to describe this scene due to time restrictions, and also I don't want to spoil the story. However, it is noteworthy that Clara's humility makes her refrain from speaking the truth, something the reader learns only from her narration. Finally, epilogue. Fanny's unequal status among her cousins at Mansfield Park has provoked ongoing discussions among literary historians about the novel's association with slavery. The slave trade is mentioned in Mansfield Park as well as in Emma, and there is a wealthy young mulatto lady in Austen's unfinished novel, Sanditon. Christine Kenyon Jones, in her 2010 paper, discusses the connection between Austen's Mansfield Park and Lord Mansfield, a powerful judge in the late 18th century, whose decision paved the way for the abolition of the slave trade. Lord Mansfield and his wife famously brought up two great nieces, the mixed-race illegitimate Dido Bell and the white legitimate Lady Elizabeth Murray. Kenyon Jones has suggested that Dido's ambiguous status in Lord Mansfield's family may have inspired Austen to describe Fanny in a similar position. Whether the Austen family was pro-slave or anti-slave is, however, still a heated debate. Devoney Rousseau's new studies published this May take a precise historical approach, and her verdict is both. As Austen's father had a connection with a plantation owner, while Austen's two brothers participated in anti-slavery movements. Equality and diversity are fundamental policies in the modern workspace. Some readers of Austen's novels fear that her narratives do not explicitly demonstrate the author's support of anti-racism. However, when we read Mansfield Park in comparison to Klara and the Sun, the author's message seems to be clear. Unlike Jane Eyre, where the protagonist rebels against conventional society, Fanny and Klara are both submissive and accept their situation. Deciphering the narrative techniques of Austen and Ishiguro, we can identify two layers. One that gives the reader an objective viewpoint from which to judge the heroine's position through the representation of speech, and another that allows the reader to share the heroine's innermost thought as represented in the narration. Ishiguro describes Austen's narrative technique with the words, using nuance and understatement. It is this subtlety that allows both authors to leave social judgment to the reader, while simultaneously guiding us to side with the heroine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We don't have much time. I would ask one question that, let's see, that Fanny is humble and self-effacing, but she's usually right. If the family acted as she would recommend, they would all be happier. Do you think the same is true of Klara? If the family was—
So would you repeat it again, the first part?
Yes. Fanny Price is humble and self-effacing, but she's usually correct in her beliefs.
Yeah.
If the family, acted like she recommended, they would be happier. Do you think the same is true of Klara?
Yeah, I think so. So Klara has a face. She has a kind of moral judgment. So she knows what she's doing right. So the scene I said that I don't want to spoil is actually testing her moral judgment. And there are lots of other scenes. She has a faith in doing the right thing that's really similar to Fanny's Christian faith.
And one more quick question. Is there a parallel to the patronage aspect that being adopted is supposed to be a great benefit to Fanny? It's harder to see how Klara being adopted by humans would be a benefit to her. Do you see a
Mm.
parallel?
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm not going to say a big claim that they are exactly the same. No, they are quite different, particularly after reading through the novel. I mean, obviously, Clara, Fanny this is a courtship novel, so she will get married. But Clara is different. But I think the point is how the both authors situated to heroines in inferior situation. And I think at the personal level, although Clara doesn't get married, obviously as a novel, but she entertains friendship, and by adopted by a family to have a strong bond with Josie, who plays like Edmund, she can feel the pleasure as a human being rather than a robot. And that is really how real human beings will find happiness. And then that's not necessarily the marriage, I think.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much.